Hi, welcome back to the workshop. Recently I was in that well-known Swedish furniture store and I picked up one of these candle holders. It gave me an idea for a bedside light. Obviously, a candle holder isn't really going to cut it when I'm reading my favourite bedtime books. So I start off with this big block of wood. This was made by some cutting, lots of gluing, clamping, and then more gluing and left to dry. My plan is to use the candle holder as a cage around a retro bowl on a cast concrete base. To save time on the lathe, I've marked out the diameter for my base. I then use my bandsaw to roughly cut it into a cylinder. To hold the blank on the lathe, I'm using a small faceplate, which is screwed in place securely, as I don't want this flying off and causing any injuries. With the faceplate secure, I can now screw this blank tightly onto the headstock. I then bring the tailstock up to support the blank and keep it steady while I'm roughing out. As I've done initial rounding on the bandsaw, it only takes a few passes with the gouge to get it to finished size. I'm not just going to have a cylindrical base with a candle holder on it, so I turn my attention to creating a stud, a bit like on a Lego brick, for the candle holder to slot onto. Once I've got the right diameter, I use a gouge to remove the rest of the material, swapping to a scraper to create some straight sides. As the candle holder has rounded edges, I feel this needs to be reflected on the base, so that top corner has to go. I've made a template from the candle holder which is going to help create something similar. It's starting to look like a Lego man's head. So the Lego man's head, forgot what I'm making here, the lamp base is taking shape nicely. I stop the lathe and do a quick test fit to make sure everything's going together well. The base is going to need a hole for the power flex to pass through, so this is probably the best time to drill it. Once I've drilled it, I can then get rid of that ridge that's left. It's not a perfect turning, so I mix up some filler, and any cracks, well, they get filled because that's what filler does. The end grain was a real problem, so that gets a nice thick coat like butter on toast. While it dries, I have a chance to quick brush up. Now the filler is dried, I can do the first of many sandings. It's the part that always seems to take the longest. I've mounted this jig on my lathe so I can cut some arches. The headstock has been locked in place. I can use my router with a trimming bit to start shaping these arches and hopefully move away from the Lego man head shape I have created. Did you see that screw roll out? Here's that screw rolling out again in slow motion. I was lucky I didn't clip that with the router bit and it would have sent it flying across my workshop. Thinking, well, where did that come from? I have a quick look and it turns out it was the screw that holds the collet on. I leave mine in place so I don't have to look for them in a drawer. I release the headstock, turn the whole blank 180 degrees and then lock the headstock again and use the router to create an arch once more. I then turn it 90 degrees and cut another arch and then rotate a final 180 to create that fourth arch. The next bit is a little tricky to explain. The mould is going to be in two parts. The arches I've just created need to stick out. I know that sounds a bit strange, just run with me on this one and I hope it will make sense later. So I'm creating a cylinder with the same radius as the top of the arch. This cylinder now needs to be split lengthways. I screwed 2 blocks of wood which will allow me to then run this through my saw and use the fence. Over to the saw, I start cutting. Don't worry, I'm going to move my thumb before the blade gets to it. See, all thumbs still attached. I'm now left with 2 semi-cylinders. I googled that to get that correct term. To create the straight sides of the arch, I glue the semi-cylinders onto a block of wood. I give the semi-cylinder a quick wiggle to spread the glue and then add some clamps to hold it in place. A quick feel of the joint to make sure everything's lined up, and once dried it's back onto the table saw to cut our excess off, and I'm left with what I'm going to call a positive arch. I need some radii on the end of these positive arches, so I've mounted a jig onto my circle cutting jig, so this jig will let me create the radius on the end of these parts, and by rotating it into the bandsaw it cuts really nicely and allows me to cut the same radius again and again. This radius is the same radius as the outside of my mould. Whether I'm going about this in the right way, I don't know. We'll find out if it works in the end. With 4 of these little positive arches cut, I can glue them in place. Once one's in, I can go on to the next. They fit like a glove. I tap them with a mallet to make sure they're seated correctly. Another little tap on that one, and then throw on some clamps to hold them in place while they dry. Now the glue has gone off, I give the whole thing a few coats of grey. I'm hoping this will help seal the wood but also show up any imperfections, as the uniform colour will highlight them. Another sanding, and then more filling, and then more sanding, and finally some more painting to finish it off. To try and save on the amount of silicone I'm going to mix up, I created this lower section with a radius about 10mm or 3/8 of an inch bigger than. These two parts slot together, and as you can see there's a gap at the bottom which goes underneath. I wrap this in some rigid plastic and then temporarily add some duct tape to hold it in place. I now fill the void with dried sand. I'm hoping this will allow me to calculate accurately how much silicone I'm going to need to mix up. I tip it back into a jug, and then this is the amount I should need. This then gets brushed out to remove any traces of that fine sand, and both parts then get a coat of mould release. Everything is now ready to be assembled, and this time I've taped my rigid plastic together more accurately, and I use some insulation tape to hold the two parts together. Now, I'm not the most experienced mould maker in the world, and I should have realised at this point it was too cold in my workshop for the silicone. It was only about 11 degrees, but I push on and mix up a little more than I actually need and stir it till it's a nice uniform colour. As I start to pour it in, I get the feeling that it's a bit thick and it's just too cold for it to flow nicely. However, I'm committed, so I carry on, hoping that I can get away with it. As I stop to move my camera for another shot, I realise that my wooden core is now floating on the silicone, and I push it down. This is the resulting mess. Schoolboy error. Always fix everything together. Fingers crossed this will still be usable. I've left the silicone to go off for a couple of days, and then I start pulling everything apart with the tape and the rigid plastic. I then use a craft knife to cut round those arches. And with a bit of wiggling and to and froing and brute force, I managed to separate these parts of the mould. I can then pull the silicone off of the wooden core, and this comes away nicely. Let's look inside, and it's not too bad. Do have some air bubbles, but I think I can work with this. I now need to make the part that is going to create these arches underneath the concrete base. This is going to be a sacrificial foam core that is going to be cut away at the end. So I use some rigid foam on my lathe, which turns down like butter to create another cylinder, the same diameter as the arches. I then use the same process of gluing, running through the jig and gluing, and this time with a central core. The mould gets a bit of silicone to plug that hole at the bottom and then sprayed with release agent. The sacrificial foam core gets pushed in and slots onto the pipe. Learning from my past mistakes, I tape it down so there's no way that when I add the concrete this foam core will float. To make the concrete, I like to use 2 parts sand to 1 part gravel and 1 part cement. I like to give everything a dry mix first to make sure I'm not missing anything. I then gradually add water to the mix, getting to a consistency that should work. Now these holes are smaller than I imagined in my head, so pouring is not going to be possible, so I have to spoon feed it in. Once the mould is full, I use my sander to vibrate out as many as bubbles as possible, which is working rather well as you can see them coming to the surface. I left the concrete for about a week just to make sure it goes off, and then start cutting the tape away that holds the mould together. Once the tape's off, the rigid plastic falls away. I can then pull the mould apart some more. It comes away nicely, and I work around that silicone, pulling it away from the concrete. As you can see by its dark colour, it still has quite a bit of moisture in it. There are some bubbles, so I remove these with an old chisel, and the majority won't show because they'll get covered by the candle holder. Now for the enjoyable process of digging out that foam core. I use an old chisel, taking care, trying not to dig into the concrete. I then pull the last bits out by hand, and I'm left with these interlocking arches underneath the concrete base, just the way I planned it, and they've turned out really nicely, even if there are some bubbles. I start tapping out the pipe that I inserted, earlier, and once it's level with the top of the base, I then fold over the end of the pipe, and then using a scrap of doweling, I tap it the rest of the way out. I just need to level the base out now, so I've stuck some sandpaper down, and I do a few passes, then rotate the base and do a few more passes. I keep doing this until the base stops rocking. The candle holder needs its handle removing, so I start on the pillar drill, which doesn't really work as the rivet keeps spinning. So I swap to a hand drill and grip that rivet with a pair of pliers. With the head of the rivet removed, the handle just pops off, and with a bit of pressure I drill the rest of the rivet out. I'm going to use these holes to try and fix the candle holder in place, so I have to open them out a bit more. I need a ring to fill a recess in the candle holder, so I use my circle cutting jig on my bandsaw and spin an offcut of plywood to make it round. Once I've cut it, I move the circle in and then start cutting again, just spinning it around until I get to the end. A bit of glue in the joint and a clamp to hold it together. This ring will also hold two nuts which grub screws will go into to hold the candle holder on. So after drilling a small pilot hole, I then swap to a step cutting bit and open the hole out to accept this nut. I find this working better than a regular drill bit. With a chisel, I change the hole from round to hexagonal, and just like that, the nut slips in place. I pull it out, spread on some epoxy, and then put it back in. This is repeated on the other side. To make this ring visually disappear, I give it a few coats with black paint. The grub screw is made by cutting a slot in the end of a threaded bar. After making the slot, I do a quick check with a screwdriver just to make sure that it's going to work. The ring just slots into place and the grub screws are wound in. The top of the concrete is given a sand with some wet and dry. I then decide, wait, why stop here? And I work round the rest of the base. Moving from a candle to a light bulb is going to require some power. So the first thing is to wire a bulb holder. To fix the bulb holder in place, I bought this kit from Amazon, and by sheer luck, this barrel nut taps snugly into place perfectly. On top of that nut, I had a washer, and then a flex clamp is screwed in. This should stop the flex from pulling out. The kit came with this 10mm threaded tube, which could be cut to size. It's then thoroughly deburred to make sure it doesn't nick the flex, and then screwed into the base. Once that's screwed in, I had a washer which I sprayed black, and a spacer that's trying to get the bulb centralised in the top. Now for the bulb holder, which simply screws onto the top, and with the flex in place I can tighten down with that clamp, which then stop the cable pulling. While I'm down here, I add some felt pads to stop the concrete scratching my nightstand, one for each leg. Obviously I don't want the light on 24/7, so the next part is on the flex is going to be an inline switch. And the last thing is a plug. And of course, to everyone outside of the UK, this thing must look strange with those 3 square pins. And now for final assembly. The upturned candle holder becomes the bulb cage. The wooden ring blends in and the grub screws are tightened to grip the concrete base on both sides. To finish them off, I add some black dome head nuts, which are just finger tightened on. And lastly, I add that retro bulb that I dreamed of while standing in the marketplace of that Swedish furniture store. And now for those sexy shots, from the finished candle holder to bedside light. The concrete base turned out how I'd imagined it. The expanded metal looks great, and the solution for fixing the two parts together works a treat. And I just love those arches. Thanks for watching.